Okay. What most people don't realize is that virtually every company is in part self-insured, and most companies never get to the insurance part. And so I'm a little surprised that we don't have more of an uproar about this and more drives for consumerism, because the companies are really shouldering these costs in a very, very direct way. Frequently, it's the second or third biggest cost on their P&L. How do we get more folks really engaged in the topic?
Well, I can relate to that, Todd. After I left Procter and Gamble, I was one of the early execs in a cloud computing startup. We took the company public. We were eventually acquired by Oracle, but I had a 12-year run in the executive team with that company. And so, we face as an executive team around healthcare for our employees because we wanted to attract and retain the very best talent to build a great company. Every company wants that. And I see that's why you're seeing increasingly more companies now are looking at incentives, more the carrot approach in terms of healthy living, which will provide better outcomes and incentives there. And again, I think that always comes back to that, Todd. It's this key word called incentive. I mean, people will go where they're incentivized. If you start incentivizing their pocketbook, they'll start modifying behaviors to perhaps reduce higher risk behaviors that impact health. And move towards a healthier lifestyle, which ultimately will have lower healthcare costs.
So one of the things that I really have admired about you, especially given your work last year on getting the COVID vaccination made readily available, and the sort of presence you had about getting the manufacturing lines up and running and taking some risk out for the companies who are developing that, I really appreciated that. And so little people gave you props for that. I've been doing it every time I can because I think it was so important and vital to getting the vaccine out so quickly. But as we look around the corner, we're starting to see the current administration talking about concentration on the hospital side of the equation, which is their concern is we have monopoly effects taking place right now. And strangely enough, the hospitals are dominated by not-for-profits. Have you started looking at that yet, or are you still just focused on the insurance issues?
Well, as you know, the healthcare there's a lot of variables in that equation. And as we're starting to see, like with hospitals, the increasing concentration of where hospitals are buying out the doctor practices, and docs are no longer, in many cases, independent businesses. They are now just part of the hospital. They're employees of the hospital.
And there's a study that came out said over 53% of physicians now are employed by hospitals today.
And so here's the problem when you have a consolidation now with physicians, when you start seeing that the healthcare companies are buying the insurance companies, they're buying the PBMs, so they're all in concert together, and so there's no sense to try to optimize cost, because now they can start to do a lot of cost shifting. And that's a problem, I believe, and only makes the process that much more opaque versus trying to drive more transparency. So that's oftentimes the first thing to do is identify the problem before you start getting the solutions in place. But I think that consolidation, while I understand if you're a physician, certainly when you think about liability protections, because of, I'm a chemical engineer, Todd, not a trial lawyer. The trial lawyers typically, I don't think I got a dime support from trial lawyers. That's because I think they oftentimes are part of driving up the costs here with this certainly frivolous kind of litigation.
So you raised an interesting point. To me, in addition to the opacity of the problem of the pricing issues, I think there's another issue, which is, to me, there's an inherent conflict of interest. We also see United Healthcare as now being a very rapidly growing physician practice as well through Optum, and they've got over 50,000 physicians employed by United. And so, to me, when you shouldn't have to ask the question, who actually am I seeing when you go to your doctor? To your point, it's a very personal decision, and you shouldn't have to ask the question, am I seeing my doctor or my insurance company when I go to my visit, or am I seeing my doctor or my hospital? Because the other thing that's happening unsurprisingly, is within that construct, the physician or the hospital are also controlling, therefore, all of the referrals throughout the course of your care, and that also feels like a conflict of interest.
Well, you think about, on one hand, we're all grateful for the amazing ongoing innovation breakthroughs as it relates to healthcare technology, the state-of-the-art. Take MRIs as an example, but those are expensive capital investments. And obviously utilization is very important. And so, of course, you're going to be incentivized, particularly, again, if the consumer is kind of out of that equation and the healthcare, the insurance company is going to pay for it, the consumer's not going to push back too much and certainly says, I need to get an MRI because it's not an out-of-pocket cost for that consumer. And so that is all part of the problem of driving the cost up, which drives premiums up. One of the other innovative areas that we need to keep an eye on that I think we learned from COVID was what's going on with telehealth services. And I included a provision in this recent piece of legislation that would actually expand telehealth services during the pandemic. Well, now we need to codify that because while telehealth is not the answer to every situation, it definitely is a way that improves efficiency. It is easier for the consumer, particularly think about seniors, or think about somebody from Montana like myself, where you live a long ways away from your healthcare provider. But if you're in the city, it's a big traffic jam to get there. So either you're having to drive a long ways or you're having to sit in traffic jams a long time, and telehealth can help alleviate some of that. What we want to do, though, is make sure that the reimbursement structure is in place that will incentivize reimbursement on telehealth. And that's something that I've been working on to allow HSA reimbursement when you have a telehealth kind of engagement with a provider.
Yeah, that's a terrific idea. The other thing that I just want to make sure, I've been doing a lot of work on economically challenged sections of cities, and specifically with regard to broadband and healthcare and how those things link up. And one of the things that people fail to remember is just because you're in a city doesn't mean that access is necessarily proximate. In South and Southern Dallas, for example, it can take you all day if you have to use public transportation just to get a few miles to Parkland Hospital for your healthcare. And in fact, usually what happens is, or I shouldn't say usually, but very frequently, they rely on church vans to get the elderly to and from their doctor's visits. And you can imagine if you have an hourly wage job and you're paid by the hour that you work, if you don't have access to telehealth, then what happens is you lose your pay when you have to go to the doctor. So not only do you have to come out of pocket to pay the doctor, but you also lose the money that you would have earned from your job to do that. And frequently the visit may be 6 to 10 minutes. So to wipe out a day for a 6 to 10 minute visit seems to be at the best uncharitable, but just doesn't make a whole lot of walking around sense. So the codification of telehealth reimbursement could be very, very powerful.
Well, we had because we had no choice with the COVID pandemic, we expanded telehealth. We saw that both in the private sector, we saw that with the VA as well. And so we're trying to keep the full court press. Now's not the time to cut back on telehealth access as we're emerging the pandemic. It's time, in my opinion, to double down on it. We tested this concept. The feedback overwhelmingly from both providers as well as for consumers was it was a good thing. And again, we're not suggesting it would replace an in-person kind of visit with a healthcare provider, but I think the law of Pareto might apply here, the 80-20. And so this bill that I have with the Democrat Center from Nevada would permanently allow that first dollar coverage of virtual care would be allowed under high deductible healthcare plans. And so this without having to first meet that deductible. So we want to create incentives now for telehealth. I think that's an innovation that we tested and it worked.